Hi, everybody. So we are today going to continue looking at the graphs of sine and cosine. Today we're going to look at specifically how you can graph them yourself by hand. So I'm going to also be using my calculator, which you'll see right above my face, to help get a sense of these problems kind of as we're working through them. And I'll give you some tips and clarify what my expectations are when you're doing these graphs. So let's start with a quick review of what we've already discussed about the graphs of sine and cosine. So we've looked at the graph of sine and cosine, but I'm going to write out the graph of sine first to kind of get a sense of overall some of the key features of these graphs as we kind of go through them. So I've actually put in my calculator already the graph of sine. So I'm graphing y equals the graph of sine x. And if I click graph, we can see that familiar periodic wave function that we looked at before. So I'm just going to transcribe that here because I want to label a couple of things on this graph. So it repeats its values over and over, and it actually repeats in both directions, those same values over and over and over again. I want to highlight a couple of the things that we talked about, which is this is a periodic function, which just means that it repeats its values. A single period of that function, if you recall, is that first cycle of the graph that it continues. This is what we call one period. And this graph is periodic in that it takes these values, and if I slide over, it repeats those values. And I slide over and it repeats those values again. If I take this and I slide to the left, it repeats those values. So it's repeating over and over and over again. And for the graph of sine, the distance that it takes to complete that first period is a distance of 2 pi, or 360 degrees if we're talking about degrees. It has that distance because that's one cycle around the unit circle, so it has a chance to obtain all of its values as it completes that cycle around. A couple of the other key features about this graph that we mentioned is its amplitude. The amplitude is the height that this function deviates from its middle or average value, so that's the amplitude. And though my graph doesn't really show it, you could see it on the calculator's graph that deviation, that amplitude, occurs equivalently in both directions. So it's one amplitude above and one amplitude below the graph. And that other feature of the graph that we talked about is the frequency. And frequency just is referring to the number of cycles that it completes in that one rotation around the unit circle. So we have one cycle, or a frequency of 1 for this sine curve. Additionally, this sine curve deviates above and below the axis by a value of 1. So that would be its amplitude, is an amplitude of 1.